thanks to the Friends of Longfellow House Washington's headquarters and the staff here at Longfellow House Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site, for having me. Thank you also to the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati for helping to fund this series of talks that I've been giving every March for Evacuation Day to look at a different aspect of George Washington's career in the House when he was here 1775-76. So let's go back to the House as it looked in 1775, when it was gray, not yellow, didn't have the porches. We know that General Washington moved into this mansion, built by the Loyalist planter John Vassall, to make it his new headquarters in the middle of July 1775. And we know that because his staff paid the bill for cleaning the whole house and getting it ready for him on July 15th. There is only one story preserved about the Commander-in-Chief coming to live here. At the front gate, the story says, the general met a black boy, son of the enslaved family that was looking after the house, that had been left behind by the Loyalist owners. The little boy was named Darby Vassall. He was probably about 6 years old. The story goes that General Washington, to set his mind at ease for his future, told the little boy to go into the house and they would tell him what to do and give him something to eat. And reportedly, little Darby inquired what would be the wages. And as we might expect, General Washington of Virginia was shocked by the audacity of this child. And he reportedly chided the boy for being so unreasonable at such a time as to expect to be paid. And Darby Vassall, he grew up to complain that George Washington was no gentleman. He wanted a boy to work without wages. Now that story wasn't written down until 1871. Nearly a century later, and it was a decade after Darby Vassall had died. It was said that he used to tell this story. When it was written down, it got mangled a bit. It was actually ascribed to his father, Anthony or Tony Vassall, but clearly the story was about a little boy. We know that Anthony Vassall, in 1780, stated in a petition to the Massachusetts government that he occupied a small tenement with 3/4 of an acre of land, part of Mr. John Vassall's estate in Cambridge, throughout the war. If that's accurate, that means that the Vassall family, his little son Darby, were living somewhere on this estate, possibly where we are right now, behind the house, in 1775. This document, by the way, is from a new database of petitions that has just been made available through Harvard and the Massachusetts Archives. So it is possible that Darby Vassall did meet George Washington under those circumstances, and up to 90 years later, when he was still alive, told this story. But we have no actual documents showing any interaction between the enslaved Vassall family, or they are actually in sort of a limbo at this stage because their owners had gone into Boston and then were going off to England, and yet they were still legally thought to be attached to the estate. We have no documents for any interaction between Washington and them. There's no payment, there's no mention in records, there's no accounts. It's as if they were simply part of the estate, like the stables. They might have been working outside the house on keeping the fields or gardens up to date, and therefore never have interacted with the general. Nevertheless, I do not dismiss this story of General Washington and Darby Vassall, even though I've come across many, many anecdotes about people meeting George Washington for which there is no evidence whatsoever. And I have two reasons to think that there's value in this story. First, nearly all those other stories are very flattering to Washington, but for Darby Vassall to tell a story about the father of our country losing his cool, a story that reminded people in 1870 of Washington's slaveholding, and for people to preserve it, it seems unusual. It seems like something that could only have come up because it actually happened and not because it was flattering the prejudices and hopes for the culture in the mid-19th century. It's not a comfortable story, really. It's funny, but it rattles some of our assumptions. It's a countercultural narrative. So I think for that case, it might really have happened. My second reason is that this story, whether it's true or false, it does encapsulate part of Washington's experience when he arrived in New England from Virginia. Here he found himself interacting with people of African ancestry in ways he never expected, probably never imagined. Washington's experiences here at the John Basil House, I believe, set him on a path to formulating a different attitude towards slavery than he had before, an attitude that eventually culminated in his will, which freed his own slaves after his death. Washington, in life, never stopped being a slaveholder. But he changed more on that issue than 99% of planters in Virginia, 99% of the men of his class. When Washington arrived in Massachusetts in July 1775, in his early 40s, his views on slavery and on people of African descent were very standard for a Virginia planter. He had been served by enslaved Africans from the day he was born in 1732. He had owned human beings since he was 11 years old. And Washington's marriage to Martha Custis, a widow, made him manager of one of Virginia's biggest slave labor plantations. In 1774, he paid taxes on 135 human beings. What did Washington expect to find in Massachusetts? Well, probably he was expecting something pretty similar. He'd made one visit before, but he wasn't very familiar with the place, but he expected Massachusetts was, like all the other parts of British North America, a slaveholding society. In fact, Massachusetts was the first British colony to write slavery into its law back in 1641. However, the institution of slavery did not dominate the economy and society in Massachusetts and New England as much as it did in other British colonies. The enslaved population appears to have peaked in 1764 when blacks were about 2.2% of the total population. And we can compare that to, say, South Carolina, where around the same time people of African descent were the majority of people in South Carolina. The black population was also concentrated in port towns to the east of Massachusetts. In 1765, more than a third of all of the slaves in the province lived in Boston. And in most of the colony, the only people who had slaves, who owned slaves, were the very elite. The richest people in town, the merchants in those big ports, and out in small communities, maybe the one richest man in town and maybe the town minister. And they usually had only a handful of slaves. Nevertheless, the idea of slavery was a big part of British Americans' thinking throughout the colonies, including Massachusetts. The colonists who protested new crown taxes used a rhetoric of liberty versus slavery that they shared with the generations of British Whigs before them. And by slavery, those authors didn't mean the enslavement of people of African descent in their own communities, and in many cases their own household. They meant that they used the term to mean subjugation to arbitrary political rule. Washington himself expressed that philosophy in a letter to a friend and neighbor on August 24th, 1774. The crisis is arrived when we must assert our rights, or submit to every imposition that can be heaped upon us, till custom and use will make us tame and abject slaves. As the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. So in that passage, Washington actually came closer than many of his contemporaries to recognizing the similarities between the political slavery he was arguing against and the real chattel slavery that he practiced on a daily basis. But unlike, there were a few politically aware Americans, active Americans, who recognized that those two things were not compatible, and they actually took steps or made advocacy against ending slavery, or different aspects of slavery. But for Washington, when he was using slavery, he was really using the word to mean different things for black people and for rich white men like himself. Indeed, when Washington came here to lead the fight for American liberties, he brought an enslaved black man with him to help, his personal servant, William Lee. And this is a painting from about 1780 by John Trumbull, who was very briefly an aide-de-camp to Washington in this house, went on to become a painter, and so he certainly knew Washington. He almost certainly knew William Lee as well. Whether he was actually trying to capture the features of William Lee at the right side of this painting, or whether he is just painting an iconic black servant, it's unclear. In October 1767, George Washington spent more than 61 pounds to buy two mulatto boys named Will and Frank, probably teenagers, from a widow named Lee in Virginia. And those young men were probably related to the widow Lee's husband. It was common for Virginia planters to buy light-skinned slaves to serve as their domestic servants. And Frank Lee became the butler at Mount Vernon, and Will Lee became Washington's personal body servant, or valet de chambre. William Lee accompanied Washington throughout the whole war, and both sides came to recognize Billy as the general's constant companion, as painted here. But Lee was never enlisted in the army. He was never an official soldier. He was always the general's personal servant and personal property. Thus, we can see slavery, the practice of slavery, was literally making Washington comfortable while he was in this house in 1775. I even think that one reason Washington chose this mansion, left behind by John Bassett, to be his headquarters was because it reminded him of Mount Vernon. It was then one of the biggest mansions in Cambridge, and the estate extended all the way down to the river, and was surrounded by fields and orchards and outbuildings, and it was served by slaves. However, in Massachusetts and in New England, society was changing. Some people were questioning slavery or aspects of it. Militia laws in the region didn't require blacks, either enslaved or free, to drill alongside whites, which meant that those blacks were not supposed to receive military training. However, in Massachusetts, instead of doing militia service, free blacks who were excluded by law from the militia, they were supposed to work on mending roads. Everyone was supposed to contribute some labor to the society, but they were not supposed to contribute military labor. However, in practice, black men were serving in the militia, in their town militia companies. The rolls of militia on April 19, 1775, the first day of the Revolutionary War, showed black militiamen in action. George Quintal's report, Patriots of Color, found 13 men described as Negro, Black, or African in service during the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and no one in New England could have missed Prince Estabrooks, a Negro man, on the casualty list that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress circulated after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He was wounded during the battle. He's usually called Prince Estabrook from Lexington. He was legally a slave. He was not legally freed until the end of the war. So, according to a strict interpretation of the law, he should not have been out there with a gun. He should not have been in the army, and yet he was. In May 1775, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety announced that only such as are free men could serve in the colony's new army to fight the British. This was a critical transition that we often overlook, the transition from the militia to an army. The militia was an emergency force. Almost all the white males between 16 and 60 were required to train to defend the society from invasions and other dangers, and those men expected their militia service to be short-term, to last as long as the emergency lasted, and then they could go home. And within days of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, General Artemus Ward, the commander shown here, warned the Massachusetts Congress that people were going home. All the men, or not all of them, but a lot of them were ready to go. So the Congress got around to authorizing a provincial army, a Massachusetts army with men signed up and paid through the end of 1775. And men enlisted under their particular officers, usually men they knew from their hometowns and respected. These men who were going from the militia into the army were ready to be full-time soldiers until December. And there were similar armies raised in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, in New Hampshire, and their officers all came and agreed to serve under General Ward. That's the beginning of the New England Army. In the middle of June 1775, around the same time as the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress adopted Massachusetts' plea to take over the army. And those same troops, the New England Army, became the Continental Army. And the Continental Congress put Washington in charge. And it appointed other generals, and it laid out a budget, and it was going to be responsible from now on for paying those soldiers. It recruited companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. But the bulk of the army that Washington took over and found when he came up here were the same New Englanders as before. And back in May, as I said, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety had announced no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatever. I don't think they actually sent home any slaves who had already been admitted, but they did tell officers by that order not to recruit any more. And that reflected an ideology of liberty, that free men shouldn't coerce slaves into fighting for them. That reflected an ideology that you had to have a stake in society in order to be loyal to it. And by a stake, that really meant property. The Committee of Safety of Massachusetts drew the line between free men and slaves, not between whites and blacks. But General Washington was not so comfortable with that. He saw the black soldiers he found in Massachusetts as a problem, as a sign that the New England Army recruiters had already been scraping the bottom of the barrel. On July 10th, 1775, a week after arriving in Cambridge, while he was still at his first house in Cambridge, the Wadsworth House near Harvard Yard, Washington sent the Continental Congress a long letter describing how much worse the situation was than he had been led to expect, and therefore, of course, how much leeway they should give him for not immediately having results. Among the other problems he noted, from the number of boys, deserters, and Negroes which have been enlisted in this province, I entertain some doubts whether the number of soldiers required can be raised here. And all the general officers agree that no dependence can be put on the militia for a continuance in camp. So Washington wanted an army, not short-term militia troops, and furthermore he wanted an army of white men. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety appears to have responded to the new commander's concerns very quickly. On July 8th, even before Washington wrote to Philadelphia, the committee proposed to tell recruiting officers, "You are not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial army," that's what they were calling the British troops at this time, "nor any stroller, Negro, or vagabond, or person suspected of being an enemy to the liberty of America, nor any under 18 years of age." And Washington's new Adjutant General, Horatio Gates, echoed those words exactly 2 days later in his first recruitment orders. So that was the official policy of the Army as of July 10th, 1775. Washington wanted to build that army in order to force the British out of Boston. And at this point in the war, the new general wanted to bring on a big battle with that enemy for two reasons. One, he thought that another battle like Bunker Hill, with lots of casualties for the royal troops, could convince the government in London that it would be too costly to try to conquer the colonies by force, and therefore make them work out a political compromise. And of course, he wanted a big battle because a big battle was how a general achieved military glory in that time. But when Washington arrived in Cambridge, with that plan in mind, he found the defenses in poor shape. He spent the first few weeks strengthening the American fortifications. Throughout the entire siege, he was worried all the time that the British troops would charge through the weak American defenses and take over more land, as they had taken over the Charlestown Peninsula in the Battle of Bunker Hill. He didn't realize that the Battle of Bunker Hill had been so costly for the British that their commanders were recommending that the army simply pull out of Boston. It was taking a long time for the London government to get that message, to decide it was all right, to send back the approval, and then there weren't enough ships and so on. So that's why the British were staying in Boston all this time. But they were not raring to get out and have another big battle. Only Washington was expecting that. So he was spending a lot of time, a lot of energy worrying about an attack that never came, and worrying about whether these troops would be up for that battle when it ever took place. And he was learning more and more about this new army, which wasn't behaving the way he thought an army would. He thought the generals weren't aggressive enough, which means that none of them would go along with his foolhardy plans to attack the British lines. He thought the officers were too friendly with the enlisted men. He thought the enlisted men were too inclined to stop work or, as he saw it, mutiny, if they didn't get exactly what they thought they had been promised. And indeed, New England soldiers, this is one of the big things he had to learn in those first months. They were inclined to consider their military service to be a contract between themselves and the government. They had enlisted, they felt, under certain conditions until the end of the year, and then they expected to go home, and if the army wasn't fulfilling those conditions, well, then the contract was somehow void. Here's an example of that thinking in action: a petition from 28 enlisted men in June 1775 explaining to General Artemus Ward that their captain was trying to switch the whole company into a different regiment with a different colonel, not the colonel that they had signed up expecting to serve under. They even said that their captain was acting under a malevolent disposition. And that's not the sort of behavior that Washington would countenance with soldiers complaining about their officers. But the New Englanders said in their petition that they had received a promise. What's more, 2 of those soldiers can be identified from other records as black, and 1 as Native American. And there's no indication on this document that those men were racially different from the rest of the soldiers. So they're all of equal status as privates, and as privates they all feel that they can complain to the commander-in-chief that they have been put into the wrong regiment. This is a petition of this petition is a snapshot of the situation that General Washington had to deal with pressure from below. And meanwhile, he was also feeling pressure from above, from the Continental Congress. He felt that Congress wanted him to free Boston by winter and not to spend too much money doing it. So, quickly, this is on the dime here. Some members of Congress were particularly concerned about the black soldiers that they were hearing about. One of those was Edward Rutledge, delegate from South Carolina, which, as I said, had a very large enslaved population. New Jersey delegate Richard Smith, his diary preserves this discussion in Congress on September 26th. E. Rutledge moved that the general shall discharge all the Negroes, as well slaves as freemen, in his army. Rutledge was strongly supported by many of the Southern delegates, but so powerfully opposed that he lost the point. The official record of the Continental Congress says nothing about this controversy, because they were trying to suppress all news of disagreement among the delegates. But clearly there was significant support in Philadelphia for excluding black men from the army immediately, sending those soldiers home. There were other delegates who probably were willing to accept the black soldiers as equal, and then there were probably, the balance, I bet, lay in men who were saying, we can't make this decision here, let's defer to General Washington, he's on the ground there, he can make the decision. In early October, as another sign of this continuing discussion in Philadelphia, John Adams wrote to 2 Massachusetts generals asking about the black soldiers, the boys, and the old men that the other delegates were complaining about. And when those other delegates complained about that, they were echoing George Washington's own words. William Heath wrote back from Massachusetts to say that there were some such soldiers, especially from Rhode Island. In a 1777 letter, Heath said, black troops were generally able-bodied, but for my own part, I must confess I am never pleased to see them mixed with white men. General John Thomas, on the other hand, the lower fellow here, in contrast, he told Adams, we have some Negroes, and I look upon them in general equally serviceable with other men in fatigue and in action. Many of them have proved themselves brave. So Thomas was perfectly accepting of black soldiers. By the time he wrote, however, there had already been a discussion of those soldiers here at headquarters. By the fall of 1775, Washington realized that it was very unlikely that he could win the war before the end of the year. That's what he had hoped back when he took the job. At the end of the year, all the soldiers' enlistments would expire, which meant that there would be no army. Well, some of those recruits from the middle colonies, from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia would still be around, but the bulk of the soldiers would be ready to go home, and he this time knew that they had this contractual idea that they were allowed to go home. This transition was both a danger, but it was also, he saw it as an opportunity to restructure the army along the lines that he would have preferred. The Continental Congress sent a high-powered committee to meet with Washington and to make plans for the new army. In preparation for that meeting, on October 5th, Washington convened all his generals here at the headquarters to discuss questions that the Congress was going to be asking. The commander took it upon himself to add another question to the agenda, not something that Congress had said we want to discuss, something he wanted to discuss. Whether it be advisable to re-enlist any Negroes in the new army, or whether there be a distinction between such as are slaves and those who are free. And the answer that the generals all came up with was, agreed unanimously to reject all slaves, and by a great majority, to reject Negroes altogether. That means that some generals, possibly John Thomas, maybe Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island, voted in favor of re-enlisting black troops, but free black troops. But a great majority of Washington's own generals, most of whom were from New England, said no to any African American soldiers at all. And I think that decision probably shows Washington's influence. Later in October, 3 members of the Continental Congress came to Washington, here to the House to confer with General Washington, and they were Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, who I think you recognize, Benjamin Harrison of Virginia at the bottom, and Thomas Lynch of South Carolina. Now, 2 of those men were rich Southern planters like Washington. And on the last day of their council, October 23rd, those men, several political leaders from New England and Washington, considered the question of African American soldiers. And it was on the agenda like this: ought not Negroes to be excluded from the new enlistment, especially such as our slaves? All were thought improper by the Council of Officers. Now, given how that question is worded, it's not really surprised that the committee decided, oh yes, they ought not to be. They ought not to be included. It was improper indeed, and they decided that blacks be rejected altogether. And General Washington quickly put that new policy, official policy, into practice. On October 23rd, he called on the Continental soldiers to re-enlist, with one major exception. These were the men already in the Army, everybody except Negroes, which the Congress do not incline to enlist again. On November 12th, he ordered colonels to come to headquarters to pick up printed enlistment forms, and Washington reminded those recruiters, neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign, enlisted. Now, around that same time, policy had been settled, he was looking ahead to the new year. Around the same time, General Washington received a letter at headquarters that must have surprised him. Yet another surprise here in New England. It said, "Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your Excellency in the enclosed poem, and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. Your being appointed by the great Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your Excellency all possible success in this great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am, your Excellency's most obedient and humble servant, Phyllis Wheatley." Now, Washington might not have known who Phyllis Wheatley was, but the New Englanders around him certainly did. She had been a local celebrity in Boston for a few years, even more so after she published a book of poems in London in 1773. Everyone knew that she was black, a native of Africa, who had been brought up in slavery. For someone like with Washington's upbringing, to receive a letter and poem like this was unthinkable. It would be like going out to the stable and finding his horse, scratching a sonnet in the dirt. Washington didn't know what to do with it. He literally didn't know. He always wanted to do the correct thing when it came to etiquette, when it came to what a gentleman should do. He always wanted to do the right thing. He had no idea what was the right thing to do in this case. So the general just let Phyllis Wheatley's papers sit on his desk, and soon they were covered by more papers. Still, reading that letter and poem in November 1775 was another of the experiences that shook up General Washington and his way of thinking about black people. Then on December 5th, 13 Army officers and a brigade surgeon filed an extraordinary petition to the Massachusetts legislature. They sought a reward for a private soldier named Salem Poor, saying, "The subscribers beg leave to report that under our own observation, we declare that a Negro man called Salem Poor of Colonel Fry's regiment, Captain Ames's company, in the late Battle of Charlestown, the Battle of Bunker Hill, behaved like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. To set forth the particulars of his conduct would be tedious. We would only beg leave to say that the person of this said Negro centers a brave and gallant soldier. The reward due to so great and distinguished a character we submit to the Congress." And the first 3 signers of this petition included Colonel William Prescott, commander in the provincial redoubt on Bunker Hill, the man whose statue stands outside the Bunker Hill Monument. It had been almost 6 months since the Battle of Bunker Hill, but only about 1 month since General Washington announced that men like Salem Poor couldn't re-enlist in the Army. And I hypothesized that this petition was a response to the new Army policy. It drew attention to Salem Poor's brave and gallant conduct just when it looked like he was going to be out of a job. For white officers in the 18th century America to describe a black man as behaving like an experienced officer, that was extraordinary praise. It's very frustrating that they did not then say why they were saying this about Poor. He is often connected with the killing of one of the first British officers to come into the redoubt on top of Breed's Hill at the end of the battle. I suspect that that officer was not Major John Pitcairn, as is often said to be. I think he was killed earlier in the battle, but certainly there was that horrible moment at the end when the British were coming over and there was hand-to-hand combat within the redoubt, and if Salem Poor were there and distinguished himself, that's something that somebody like Colonel Prescott would remember and praise. In any event, the Massachusetts legislature held on to the petition for Salem Poor until January 1776, and then gave him leave to withdraw it, which was a euphemism for rejecting it. But by that point, Salem Poor's situation, his connection with the American Army, had changed. Now, in December 1775, the same month as that petition, 2 more developments helped Washington to rethink his new policy about allowing black soldiers to re-enlist. First, he received word from Virginia that Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, had promised freedom to male slaves who joined the royal forces, who came to the governor's defense. Washington had been worrying about Dunmore for months. Since the summer, there had been even rumors that the governor would sail up the Potomac and attack Mount Vernon. Now, Washington's overseer, a cousin named Lund Washington, even wrote about the possibility of arming the men on the plantation, black or white, to protect Martha Washington from Lord Dunmore. Apparently, he felt that he could rely on the Washington's own slaves. You always think your own slaves are going to be loyal. It's the other people's slaves you have to worry about. Dunmore's threat worried Washington. On December 26th, he wrote to his friend and fellow Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, "If, my dear sir, that man Dunmore is not crushed before spring, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. His strength will increase as a snowball by rolling, and faster if some expedient cannot be hit upon to convince the slaves and servants of the impotency of his designs." Washington's response was not to suggest arming blacks in Virginia to fight Dunmore. Rather, he wanted to convince them to remain on the plantations as docile and loyal workers. But, nevertheless, this was something that was on his mind. And the biggest thing on his mind, I think, at the end of 1775, was the fact that those New England soldiers were all about to go home. Their enlistments were all going to expire at the end of December. Some of them had signed on for more, others had not. Most others had not. In fact, regiments from Connecticut, they had signed up for a slightly different term, so they were starting to go home in the beginning of December, and that Washington was seeing as a mutiny, and they were seeing as, time's up, we have a contract. But even if you expected them to stay around for a little bit longer, you still had all the Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island troops leaving at the end of the year. That would leave only the few companies from the middle colonies. Even Thomas Lynch of South Carolina recognized the end of the enlistments was a crisis that required new thinking, and he wrote to Washington, "Your riflemen, Negroes, and deserters may in proper passes defend your artillery." So he was thinking that if you had a smaller army, you could nevertheless get up into the hills, the big hills out in Auburndale or somewhere, and defend the passes from the British army streaming out of Boston. A South Carolinian recommending the use of black soldiers in this crisis. Quite simply, the American commander could no longer afford to turn away willing soldiers. And furthermore, it really couldn't have escaped Washington's attention by this point. He had been in this part of the country for nearly 6 months. That the black soldiers in his army had fought and served as respectably as the whites. They were causing no great turmoil in the ranks. There might have been a brawl in Harvard Yard at some point between a Marblehead company and, or Marblehead regiment and some of those riflemen, but that's a bit misty. And in any case, the riflemen had proved to be big troublemakers all over the army. So with all those factors weighing on him, at the very end of the year, General Washington changed his mind. On December 30th, he created, all on his own, a new policy in his general orders. As the general is informed that numbers of free Negroes are desirous of enlisting, he gives leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them and promises to lay the matter before the Congress, who he no doubt will approve of it. Or who he doubts not will approve of it. It's not clear who informed the commander of those volunteers. Perhaps that's a reference to those officers who were championing Salem poor. Perhaps that was General Thomas or General Greene or other people. Perhaps recruiting officers themselves were writing in and saying, can't we make an exception for this man? Maybe it was just wishful thinking that he was receiving this news, but in any case, the main point is Washington made this 180-degree turn on this issue over 2 months. Then the next day, Washington wrote back to the Congress, it has been represented to me that the free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded. As it is to be apprehended that they may seek employ in the ministerial army, I have presumed to depart from the resolution respecting them, and have given license for their being enlisted. If this is disapproved by Congress, I will put a stop to it. I doubt that there is a real danger of free black soldiers defecting to the British inside Boston. The situation in Massachusetts was just too different from the situation in Virginia. But Washington probably knew that if he made that argument, his fellow Southerners would accept it after Dunmore. Once again, Congress did follow the general's recommendation, and on January 16, 1776, it resolved that the free Negroes who have served faithfully in the army at Cambridge may be re-enlisted therein, but no others. In practice, I don't think the recruiting officers followed those rules exactly. They enlisted new black recruits as well as re-enlisting old ones. Quite soon they were enlisting enslaved men, even though there were rules against enslaved soldiers. And General Washington did not object or remind them of that detail. He needed soldiers. Once Washington changed his mind about re-enlistment, he accepted African American enlisted men on the same basis of white ones. They were paid the same, they received the same food and clothing, which at times was quite inadequate. They were not segregated from whites in their companies. In the middle of the war, Rhode Island raised a couple of regiments that mostly composed of African Americans and Native American men. Those regiments fought well around Newport in 1779, but during an organization of troops the next year, Washington called for integrating all the Rhode Island troops to abolish the name and appearance of a black corps, he said. So he actually wanted an integrated army. The Continental Army was integrated at that enlisted level. It was the last integrated American army until after World War II. To be sure, there were no black officers in the Continental Army. Washington and his fellow leaders weren't willing to shake up society by going that far. The closest they came was in 1779 when the Continental Congress gave a lieutenant colonel's commission to Colonel Lewis Atiyatarongata. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that because I surely have. He's a man who visited Washington twice at this house. He's usually known as Colonel Lewis. That's how Washington referred to him in his letters. Colonel Lewis's father had been a black man working for the British Army, possibly enslaved around 1740, and his mother was an Abenaki woman. They had been captured, the mother and child, and adopted into the Cognawaga Mohawk community near Montreal. And most of the Mohawk community sided with, most of the Mohawk Nation sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, but Colonel Lewis chose the American side. He received the official American Army Commission as a reward, and that made him the highest ranking man of African ancestry to fight in either army during the war. Now, Washington probably viewed Colonel Lewis not as a black man, but as a Mohawk. He lived as a Mohawk. He was part of that community. He was always part of a sort of specialized corps of allies rather than in the regular Continental Army, but he still was an official lieutenant colonel. Less than 3 months after Washington changed his mind on black soldiers, the British military finally abandoned Boston. As I said, the British commanders had wanted to leave for a long time, but with added artillery and gunpowder, the Continental Army finally pushed them out more hastily than the British would have wanted to leave. General Washington had finally won the first campaign of the war, but he wrote to relatives about feeling disappointment, he said, when the army sailed away, because he didn't have a chance to fight that big glorious battle and destroy them. Washington didn't realize that the real value of the siege of Boston, as it turned out, was how it gave him experience in administering the Continental Army. It gave him the chance to promote national values to soldiers and officers from different colonies, to show them his own commitment to the cause, and those months taught him the strength of the New England soldiers, which continued to be the bulk of his army throughout the war. New England soldiers, including the black men. Here are a couple of ways we might be able to glimpse Washington changing. On February 28th, he managed to write back to Phyllis Wheatley finally and thank her for the poem. He apologized for not having written earlier, and he praised her talents and genius. He was still struggling with the etiquette of the situation. When speaking with enslaved women, he would address them by first name. So he should, in that case, he would refer to Phyllis Wheatley as Phyllis. But etiquette called for addressing a letter to a respected white woman by Mrs. Adams, or whatever her name was. He had to have the honorific. So how should Washington address a letter to Phyllis Wheatley? He had never faced that situation before. Probably nobody he had ever met in Virginia had ever faced that situation before. And in the end, he compromised and he wrote the letter to Miss Phyllis. So the honorific and the first name together. But he also ended that letter, "Your obedient humble servant." And that was a formula, but considering that this was a man who had over 100 humble servants of his own, that was pretty amazing. In the letter, Washington also invited Wheatley to come visit him at headquarters. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like she ever did. His aides and other people would surely have mentioned that in their letters because she was such a celebrity. She also never mentioned, when she was trying to publish another book in Boston after the war, she never mentioned having met Washington, and he was such a celebrity at that point that it would have been a real coup for her to be able to do that. Now, Phyllis Wheatley was not the only black woman Washington encountered here at his Cambridge headquarters. On February 22nd, 1776, about the same time, 4 days before he wrote that letter to Phyllis Wheatley, the headquarters steward recorded this expense on the accounts for General Washington's headquarters: paid Margaret Thomas for making 3 shirts for William. Margaret Thomas was a free black woman who became part of the domestic staff here at headquarters, and William was Will Lee, Washington's personal body servant. Thomas kept working for the Commander-in-Chief's headquarters during the first years of the war. We have even her signature on a bill from 1778. She probably worked for him all the way to 1783. And that was when the end of the war came, and Washington and Will Lee went home to Mount Vernon. The next year, on July 28, 1784, Washington had to write to his agent in Philadelphia. "The mulatto fellow William, who has been with me all the war, is attached, married," he says, "to one of his own color, a free woman, who during the war was also of my family," from his household. "She has been in an infirm state of health for some time, and I had conceived that the connection between them had ceased, but I am mistaken, and they are both applying to me to get her here. And though I never wished to see her more, yet I cannot refuse his request, if it can be complied with on reasonable terms, as he has lived with me so long and followed my fortunes through the war with fidelity." Washington therefore asked his agent to look for Margaret Thomas in Philadelphia and send her to Virginia. So this letter reveals that Washington recognized a connection between Margaret Thomas and Will Lee, though he was surprised to hear or to be told that that connection had gotten as formal as marriage. He was obviously less fond of Margaret Thomas than Lee was, and yet he felt that he had to agree to this couple's wish to be together. This powerful slave owner agreed to do something that he didn't want to do, something that would cost him money, something that he thought could only lead to trouble, because he felt he owed one of his slaves. And that was an extraordinary development. unfortunately, that's the end of that story, because nobody has found any more evidence about Margaret Thomas. Whether she was found in Philadelphia, she never appears on the records of Mount Vernon. Will Lee is there for the rest of his life, many decades later, but he is never mentioned as having a wife. Washington freed Will Lee in his will, and he arranged for the freedom of all the other slaves he owned, as I said earlier. He had lived his entire adult life as a slaveholder. Those people weren't freed until sometime after his death. But he also, in his will, freed more people than all but a handful of his fellow planters in the American South. And I think Washington started on his journey to that very unusual decision here at his Cambridge headquarters in the first year of the Revolutionary War, when he realized that there was more value in black troops than he ever imagined. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments. Yes, sir.
You know, there were similar types of arguments and debates in the Civil War in Lincoln's administration. And I know Lincoln sort of studied Washington and Jefferson, all the founding fathers. I was just wondering if Lincoln knew what you discovered in some of your research. Particularly some of those debates in the Continental Congress.
There was in 1862, Massachusetts Historical Society published a long study of blacks in the Revolutionary War, which was clearly meant to pave the ground for recruiting blacks in the Civil War. So the historical example of the Continental Army was very much involved. I don't know if they went into this level of detail, because they were actually the men who were making that case were actually they used a lot of the examples from later in the war when the black soldiers were fighting and fighting respectively, rather than this very iffy problem that when it was in 1775 when it could have gone either way. Yes, Joe?
I was wondering, when Martha Washington came here with her entourage, including her own enslaved people, isn't record of what, I know her letters are not existent mostly.
They're only,
But the other people in their entourage, did they mention the blacks or any reference to
I was not able
community?
to find any mention of an enslaved person from Mount Vernon except for Will Lee coming with Washington. Now it would with either Washington, with either George at the beginning in July or Martha in December, and clearly. It is possible that when George arrived, he sent home his coach, he bought a new vehicle, he may have sent home his driver and other entourage except for William Lee. Clearly when Martha came in December, she had a coach, she had a driver, she had probably a maid, she brought her son and daughter-in-law, they probably had servants, and yet none of those names are recorded because they were part of Washington's personal expenses, and therefore they did not get into the official army expenses, government expenses that are quite nicely laid out for us. So at one point, for instance, there is a mention in the army expenses of paying Peter for a rope for the stable. Now, the use of the first name implies that perhaps this was an enslaved person, although sometimes black people in New England also went by only one name. Is this somebody already attached to the estate? Is there somebody living nearby? Is this somebody from Washington? We don't know. But that's the closest we can get. So it's really very frustrating that we don't have those records.
Do the British policies officially, fluctuate? What's their official policy? I know Lord Dunmore creates the Ethiopian Regiment, but then he's defeated at Great Bridge, and he goes off. Do the British policies fluctuate?
The British used, yes, they did fluctuate. For instance, in early 1776, the Lancey's Brigade, which is a loyalist troop, it forbids black soldiers from enlisting or slaves. But later on in the war, during the Southern campaign in Savannah, in Charleston, in Yorktown, there are large numbers of African American slaves escaping to the British lines, because
Right.
the British at that point decided as a practical matter that they would offer freedom to the people enslaved to patriots.
Right.
And so it was clearly a pragmatic decision. It was not principled. It was not that they were against slavery, because if you were loyalist, you got to keep your slaves. But they were trying to cripple the economy of the patriot territories by taking away their labor force.
Right, but even then, isn't Cornwallis kind of troubled about that?
He's
Like
troubled
he's
because
trying to trump up support, but he's also accepting these Africans. He's not arming them, with the exception of the Hessian regiments. They're bringing in musicians. They're bringing in musketeers.
and there's this type of military worker called a pioneer, who
Right.
was basically working, building fortifications, things like that, and those were often African American escapees. And there were a couple of problems for Cornwallis and the other British commanders with this policy. One was it was making them extremely unpopular with the white slave-owning population of these towns. So anybody who had been neutral before was now becoming anti-British. And
The reverse effect of their objective.
that's right. It
Yeah.
was coming back to bite them in the behind. And Sylvia Fry's book, Water from the Rock, actually argues that that was a crucial element of why the British lost in the South. Another element is that if you want to do it this way, if you want to get all the best labor and from the other side to your side, what you want is the young men to come, the strong men, the healthy, and whole families were coming, and women, and it eventually, this became a burden for the Cornwallis' army, which is already having trouble with supplies.
Yeah.
That they were also trying to feed all these people, and there is a heartbreaking moment towards the end of the siege of Yorktown where they are expelling
Yeah, they turn
blacks
them
out of the British-held area because they can no longer feed them, and there's an issue possibly of smallpox because they were getting into an emergency situation. At the very end of the war, in both Charlestown and New York, which had been held for many years by the British forces, they provided haven and sailed away with thousands of African American loyalists who then colonized parts of Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone in Africa and remained in the British Empire. So I'm not even sure I should call them African American loyalists because they were African British loyalists. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, yeah, I'm kind of confused. It seems like they weren't always, the African American soldiers weren't always guaranteed freedom. It seemed like they were taking a gamble. And so was there another reason they would want to fight in the war besides getting freedom in the end?
Well, you were paid.
Yeah.
You were autonomous. There was no guarantee. It is often said that this young man Pompey was told by his master that if he went off and joined the army, he would be free. But there was no legal requirement for that. And so some African American soldiers who joined the Continental Army later on were freed at the beginning. Some came back and were freed. There's no regularity. You're right. There is no consistency.
But what about like the Native American? What would be their benefit for fighting in the war?
Again, they would be paid.
Yeah.
In some cases, here in New England, there were separate Native communities, like the Stockbridge community, which was a so-called praying Indian community, a group of people who a couple of generations before had converted to Christianity, and they were living in a sort of hybrid Native New England culture out in Stockbridge. And they enlisted in a large group, and they were here at the Siege of Boston even before Washington arrived. Then there were other people who were living in communities, in English communities, throughout Massachusetts, often at the subsistence level. And in some cases, they just saw more opportunity joining the Army. And the man who signed that petition I showed earlier, that he was probably of that nature because he was one of the few Native Americans in that company. He was from Framingham, which was right next to Natick, which was another of these praying Indian communities that
Oh, yeah.
had become more and more anglicized as time went on. So it was, I mean, there's also a cultural aspect here. They could have taken in some of the New England Whig patriot values. They could have also been working on some values of their own culture, which greatly respected the warrior as a member of the community, as did, frankly, New England had been at war with France off and on for over a century, so they also thought it was what young men did was go off to war and fight France. They had to work out who they were fighting against and who they were fighting with, but it was much the same for the young New Englanders. Sir?
With these blacks who enlisted, joined the army, is there any evidence that they were re-enslaved after the war?
Are there cases of blacks going back to being enslaved? I can't think of any, but the records are not very clear. It's not. It takes quite a while before we have a real settled system of keeping track of who's in the army and not. Charlie, do you know
Well,
examples?
remember that by 1783,
Oh, that's right.
Massachusetts had eliminated slavery.
Yes, here in Massachusetts, under the Constitution of 1780, within 3 years, slavery became unenforceable by law. In Rhode Island, it remained longer, and there were also more blacks in the population in Rhode Island. So that's one place I might look. It would have been difficult within the Whig ideology to demand somebody come back and be a slave for you after you've sent him off to war to keep yourself from being drafted, which is the way the situation often worked. That's not to say people didn't try it. Another element of slavery in New England, which is kind of hard to grasp, is that just as New Englanders saw their army service as a contract, so there was also this feeling that slavery was somehow a covenant between the slaveholder and the worker. And the slaveholder had the responsibility to maintain his enslaved worker when that person got too old to look after himself or herself. So there are a lot of cases, including here with the Vassal family, where they were making the case that, look, we've spent years and years working for this estate or working for this man. Now we're old, he can't just throw us out. We need support. We are owed something. And so there might be cases of people coming back from the army and saying, okay, I've been wounded, you need to support me. And a legal case about that. And often people who had been enslaved were very worried that, as the saying goes, master chewed the beat, and master now has to feed on the bone, but master's tossing him away, tossing away the worker just when he becomes an expense instead of an asset, and that wasn't seen as fair. So there might be court cases like that. Here in 1780, I showed the petition from Anthony Vassal. He petitioned the state saying, I worked for this Vassal family. My wife has worked for this Vassal family. Our children have worked for this Vassal family for years and years. Now you're selling this estate. You're getting all the benefit. You, the state, are getting all the benefit from this property. We are owed a living. And he got a small pension from the state, which he asked for part of the land, which they didn't give him. And he got this small pension, which allowed him to set up a business as a farrier looking after horses in Cambridge for the next, 3 decades. And after his death, his widow went and got the pension for herself as well for about a year before she died. So that was the remnant of this idea that there was a contract between the estate, or John Vassal, and the people who were enslaved on it, that they should not be just tossed out.
Wasn't that also really enforced by laws for Massachusetts, by Massachusetts communities? In
Well,
order not to.
If Massachusetts did have this rather generous poor, support for the poor, so that if there were poor people who belonged to the town, who were born in the town, whether enslaved or free, then the town was responsible for making sure they didn't starve to death,
Exactly.
which is very basic, but it was very close. So a lot of the town records, as you probably know, are towns arguing with each other, okay, this person doesn't belong to us, he belongs to you. And the state sometimes has to start putting in the money and so on. So it was the same thing, that one of the reasons that the governments would enforce the responsibility of slave owners to look after their retired property, that's not the best word for it, but their older slaves, was that if they didn't, then the town, the community as a whole, had to take over that expense, and they didn't want it to do that. There's a case in Vermont, which, now Vermont is known for having slavery barred in its constitution in 1777, but there's a case from 1780 where a man had moved to Vermont, had a black woman working in his house for, as far as we can tell, no pay for years and years, and then when she leaves, he decides he doesn't have to pay for her, and she leaves, then she gets sick, and he insists that no, he doesn't have to pay for her, even though he brought her to Vermont and had her labor for many years, because slavery is illegal in Vermont, so you can't enforce this on me. And the Vermont Supreme Court actually decides in his favor, and this woman, when she needs support being sick, becomes a public charge rather than a charge on this one rich man. So the law can cut different ways. It's not always, well, it usually works for the rich, but it's not always consistent in how it does so.
I have a common question. Tony Vassal's house was at Shepherd and Mass Ave, which was then Northern Avenue, so where Starbucks is. Just about, that's where he had built his house. It's amazing to me how many people who live around here don't realize slaves were ever here, not here, in Massachusetts. I was wondering how many blacks were living in Cambridge in 1775? Yeah, I know that's in your book.
It's in my study. I did a big study for the National Park Service. I don't have that number in my head. Well, I have the number 77 in my head. I don't know whether that's the number of slaves in the Cambridge. In the 1765 census is the one that we have the most detail on. I don't know whether that's the number from that census or whether it's from the year 1777 or something like that. But it was that level. It was pretty small. A lot of them, however, were in this area of Tory Row, which consisted of very wealthy families, many of whom had wealth from sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So they were used to having slaves work for them. In fact, all their money came from having slaves work for them. And when these families left, most of them at the start of the war, they took a lot of those people with them. Or, in the case of John Vassall, I bet he took some people with him and left Anthony Vassall, Cuba Vassall, his wife, and their children here to try to keep this house and his aunt's house across the road safe and looked after, because they expected to come back when the trouble was over. So that's how Anthony and Cuba Vassall became free. Yes.
For example, numbers of slaves. How do you know? You study the primary resources and record it. Who is the recorder? I'm thinking like Hillary Clinton, the things and emailing.
Well, yes. Whenever a historian looks at a document, you have to figure out, okay, what are the biases of this document? What we have for the enslaved population is the census of 1765. And then we also, in some cases, for some towns, we have the tax records. And slaves were called, they were officially, in Massachusetts, we didn't have slaves, we had servants for life. And servants for life was a form of property, and most of the taxes in New England were property taxes. So there was an incentive for the town to count all the slaves in town, because that meant they could collect taxes on those people. For the census, it's, the incentives work a little bit differently. For instance, one of the purposes of the census is to figure out who's available for the militia. So they count all the people above the age of 16, all the white people above the age of 16 and below the age of 16, so that they know how many white men above the age of 16 they can call up for the militia. They don't, I think, do that same counting for the blacks because the blacks are not officially supposed to be part of the militia. So it's hard to tell. We don't have as much data on that. So you're right. The way the data is recorded reflects the biases and needs of the people who are making the data. Another very useful source in finding this sort of property is the probate records when somebody dies. John Vassall's uncle, Henry Vassall, died in 1769. His will and his inventory of what property he left includes the names of people and their value. Not their age, their value, their financial value. Same thing with the his wife, Penelope, was originally Penelope Ryle. She lived over in the Ryle house in Medford, and we have estate records from there talking about where it's like. So it is possible using those records to trace Cuba Vassall from the Ryle house as a child to the house across the street as an adult, and then Penelope sold her to John Vassall here in this house shortly before the war. And then, as Jim said, I guess she lived near the Starbucks. So. Any more? One more in back. Last.
I heard this vague story of Benjamin Franklin before the war having conversations with parliamentarians in London, and they were saying after the Somerset case, to we can bypass all this conflict if you just give the right of trial by jury to all the slaves. And you mentioned Benjamin Franklin as a part of that committee. I was wondering if you knew of any kind of backdoor meetings or any kind of communications George Washington might have had with Benjamin Franklin or anybody else who had been in those type of channels with London to influence that decision.
Okay, I know that there have been some recent studies on the Somerset case, and I haven't read all of them.
What is this?
The Somerset case was a very controversial case, a legal case in Britain. What happened was a customs official named James Stewart was sent over from Scotland to Virginia. There he bought a man named James Somerset. They both came up here to Boston, actually, where he worked for the customs office for a couple of years, and then he went over to London, taking this man. At this time, slavery was the law everywhere in the British Empire. After a year or so, James Somerset left. He refused to keep working for Stewart. Stewart tried to have him captured and brought back. Somerset argued on the basis of British law that he was free, that there had never, in fact, been slavery instituted in Britain. This became a test case, a big case. There are letters from James Stewart after a couple of years saying, I'm no longer involved, really. It's these Caribbean planters who are paying all the legal costs for this case because they knew that this was going to be the basis of their entire fortune, their entire way of life. In 1773, the Lord Chief Justice of Britain, on behalf of the court, Lord Mansfield, issued a statement that basically said that slavery was unenforceable in Britain, that any enslaved person who arrived in Britain was, by stepping on British soil, free. And this became, some people say it was actually it's not quite a bone of contention as part of the Revolutionary War, but it may have increased the anxiety of the Southern American planters who also depended entirely on slave labor for their lifestyle. That, okay, if that's the way things are going in Britain, they're not looking after our interests at all. And at the time of the Somerset case, Benjamin Franklin was in London. He had been there for several years, working as a lobbyist, basically, for various American colonies, including part of the Massachusetts government. So he was trying to negotiate, come up with ways to make British policy work better. And I'm sure he had discussions of the Somerset case. Now, Franklin is an interesting figure when it comes to the question of American slavery, because as a young man, he owned slaves. Well, as a very young man, he was an apprentice to his older brother, whom he did not like. They weren't getting along. So he, in fact, had the experience of being enforced labor for a while. Then, as a young businessman in Pennsylvania, he owned slaves. He had runaway slave advertisements and slave sale advertisements in his newspaper, so he was benefiting from the system. He went over to London. By the time he came back to America in 1775 to become a member of the Continental Congress and to meet with Washington and to do other things, he seems to have moved away from slavery. And it is thought that, for instance, when the committee met and discussed whether to have blacks in the army, he might have been a dissenting voice. He might have said, no, that's fine. Certainly by the later in the war, and when he comes back after the war and became a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and then in the early federal period, he is actually advocating for abolitionism. So he has had a gradual change over time. When he was in London as a lobbyist, he would have been representing the interests of the people who are paying him. And I don't think that would have, at that point, gone so far as to advocate equal rights or abolitionism. But he may well have, he was certainly personally moving on the issue. Okay, thank you all very much.